There is a particular kind of exhaustion that no amount of rest can fix, not the kind that lives in your muscles after a long day of work, not the kind that pulls at your eyelids after midnight. This is the kind that settles deep in the chest, the kind that comes from carrying something enormous, alone, for so long that you have forgotten what your own body feels like without the weight. Karl Haskins knew that exhaustion better than he knew his own reflection. He was the most feared alpha in the known North. Every wolf pack across 5 territories whispered his name like a warning. Children were told stories about him, not fairy tales, but real ones with real consequences, packs that had tested his boundaries and lost, alliances that had tried to form against him and dissolved before they ever had the chance to breathe. He had inherited chaos at 19 years old and built something from it that looked, from the outside, like a kingdom. From the inside, it looked like a man standing in a room where the walls were slowly pressing inward. And Winnie Valor had absolutely no idea who he was when she told him to step out of her light. That is where this story starts. Not with a grand ceremony, not with a dramatic declaration, not with anything that would make a legend nod in recognition. It starts with a cold morning, a sick child, a woman who had been moving for so long that stopping terrified her, and a man so powerful that everyone around him had forgotten to ask whether he was all right. Some love stories begin with a look across a crowded room. This one begins with a shoulder, and a choice to stay very still. Outpost Fenrir sat on the edge of the northern reach like a stone someone had dropped and forgotten. 36 buildings clustered against a ridge of black rock. A river ran cold and narrow along the southern edge. The mountains behind it were the color of iron in winter, enormous, indifferent, real, in the way that only wild things are fully real. No softness anywhere, no concession to comfort. Winnie Valor stepped out of the carriage at dawn and looked at it the way she looked at every new place, with her eyes, not her feelings. She was 31 years old, and she had been traveling for 3 of those years. Before that, she had belonged somewhere. She did not let herself think about before that. Her medicine satchel was worn brown leather, its handle darkened from years of being held in the same grip. She swung it over her shoulder, the way you swing something so familiar it has become part of your body. Her dark hair was braided back from her face. Her coat was practical, not elegant. Her boots had mud on them from the last settlement, and she had not bothered cleaning them, because she would only accumulate more mud before the day ended. The settlement elder, a compact man named Harlan Bonner, met her at the carriage with his hat in both hands and an expression she had learned to read years ago. That expression said, "We waited too long to ask for help." She did not say that out loud. She never did. "How many confirmed?" she asked, already moving. Harlan fell into step beside her. 6, he said. But 3 more showing signs since yesterday morning. Children or adults? Both. Leona McGraw's youngest is the worst. 5 years old. She has not kept water down in 2 days. Winnie's jaw tightened. 2 days without water in a child that small was not an inconvenience. It was a countdown. "Take me to her first." The sick room was in the largest building, a converted meeting hall with high ceilings and too many drafts. 3 pallets lined against the east wall. A fire burning in a corner hearth, too high on one side and inadequate on the other. The air smelled of pine resin and something faintly metallic, the particular smell of rooms where illness has taken hold and people are fighting it with whatever they have. 2 resident healers looked up when she entered. Their faces carried the gray weight of people who had not stopped working long enough to eat properly. Winnie identified the youngest patient without needing to be shown. A girl, 5 or 6, small even for her age, lying on the nearest pallet with her eyes closed and her tiny fists curled at her sides. She went to her, crouched beside her, began her examination with quiet, practiced hands. Behind her, the door opened. Winnie felt the change in the room before she identified its source. A specific kind of stillness that rippled outward from the entrance, the way all sound draws slightly inward when something commanding walks through a door, not because anything commanded silence, but because the air itself seemed to notice. She did not turn around. "I need the room quieter," she said, her voice level and unhurried. "Whoever just walked in either find something useful to do or wait outside. This child needs to hear herself breathe." The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of people pausing to listen. It was the silence of an entire room choosing between instinct and shock narrowly winning. Harlan Bonner made a sound that was halfway between a word and a breath that abandoned itself. Winnie finished her examination, noted what she needed, and stood. Only then did she turn. Karl Haskins stood near the door. She registered several things about him in rapid succession, the way you register important information when your mind is already working quickly. Tall, considerably taller than most men she had encountered. Broad across the shoulders, dressed practically in dark clothing that made no effort to announce wealth or power. His dark hair was cut close. His face was still in a manner that was not the stillness of calm, it was the stillness of absolute control, the kind that takes years to build and costs something real to maintain every single day. His eyes were the color of deep water just before it goes too dark to see the bottom. They were fixed on her. Every other person in the room had stopped moving. The two healers had gone rigid. Harlan Bonner's hat had made it to his chest, clutched there now like a small shield. Winnie looked at Karl Haskins and thought, with the quiet, professional portion of her mind, "He has not slept properly in a long time." His eyes give it away. Then she said, "You are standing in front of the supply shelf." He was not standing in front of the supply shelf. He was 3 feet to the left of it, but it was enough of a direction that he glanced sideways to confirm, and the half-second of movement gave her room to step past him and reach the herbs she needed. She heard the exhale from Harlan Bonner. She chose not to comment on it. "You are the healer from the Western Circuits." Karl's voice, when it came, was low and precise. Not a voice built for warmth, but not unkind either. The voice of someone who chose every word before releasing it. "Winnie Valor." She was already measuring dried root into a clay bowl. "And you are Karl Haskins. You know who I am. I know what you look like from Harlan's description. He left out how tall you are." She did not look up. "He also told me you arrived 2 days ahead of me, which means you have been here long enough to see how the sickness presents. What have you observed?" A pause. Then, to his credit, Karl Haskins answered the question. He spoke with the kind of precision that she had only ever heard from 2 categories of people, those who had been formally educated in close observation, and those who had learned it the hard way because their survival once depended on it. He described what he had seen clearly and without embellishment. She listened, asked follow-up questions, adjusted her initial assessment. When she was done, she made her list of what she required, handed it to one of the local healers, and went back to the child. "Does she have a name?" Winnie asked Harlan, who had materialized at her elbow. "Clara," he said. "Clara McGraw." Winnie touched the back of her fingers to Clara's forehead. Still feverish, but not climbing. "All right, Clara," she said, quietly enough that it was only for the child. "You and I are going to figure this out." She did not hear Karl Haskins leave, but at some point she looked up, and he was no longer in the room. She noticed his absence the same way she noticed the fire was too high on one side. As a fact, as data, as something to file and return to later. She had a great deal to do before later arrived. By midday, she had examined all 9 patients. By afternoon, she had a treatment protocol that she walked both resident healers through step by step, adjusting for the supplies they had and the ones they did not. By evening, Clara McGraw had kept down 3 small cups of a particular herbal preparation and had opened her eyes and asked, in a thin voice, whether there was soup. Winnie said yes, though soup was not yet advisable. She said it anyway. Sometimes what the small ones needed most was not medicine. It was the certainty that someone in the room believed they were going to be well enough to eat soup soon. She was in the outer room of the converted hall, repackaging her supplies, when she heard the door open behind her. Karl Haskins again. She knew before she turned the quality of the room's attention shifted the same specific way. The child is improving. Not a question. He had clearly already checked. Early signs are good. She kept organizing her supplies. I would not celebrate until 48 hours pass without regression. Is that your professional assessment? Or your caution? She considered. Both. They are the same thing in my line of work. He moved further into the room. Not close, but closer than before. In the lantern light, she could see the detail Harlan's description had lacked the fine lines at the corners of Karl's eyes that had no business being on a face that young, put there not by age but by something more specific, something prolonged. She had seen that particular kind of wearing down before. She knew what caused it. You did not bow, he said. I had a patient. Others have offered lesser explanations. Then I hope the patient was worth it to them. He looked at her for a long moment. She returned the look without adjusting her expression. She was not being brave. She was genuinely not afraid of him in the way that people were usually afraid, not because she lacked good sense, but because fear of that particular flavor required believing that someone's power over others extended to herself. She had never built that belief about anyone. I will want a full report in the morning, Karl said. Every settlement in this territory needs to know what you have found here. I give reports to whoever is asking about the health of the patients. Who that is tends not to matter much to me. Something shifted in his expression. The tiniest movement, gone almost before it arrived. If she had to name it, she would have called it surprise, with a trace of something underneath that she did not yet have language for. Tomorrow morning, he said. The main hall. He left. Winnie finished repacking her satchel. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the mountains, blue-black now in the failing light. Enormous and indifferent, and beautiful in the way that things were beautiful, when they did not know or care that you were looking at them. She thought about the lines at his eyes. She thought about the quality of his stillness, the kind that required active maintenance, not the kind that came naturally. She pressed the thought down and went to check on Clara. 3 days into her work at Outpost Fenrir, Winnie had established a rhythm. Early mornings belonged to the sickroom observations, adjustments, the slow arithmetic of improvement or regression. Midday, she spent reviewing supply inventories and drafting requests for what was needed. Afternoons took her through the settlement, talking to anyone who showed early symptoms, explaining what to watch for, what to do. Karl Haskins, she noticed, had his own rhythm. He was always somewhere nearby. Not hovering, she would have noticed hovering, and she suspected she would have said something direct about it, but present, at the edge of things, talking quietly with pack elders in the afternoon, while she moved through the settlement in the morning, meeting with his guard in the evenings when she was in the sick room, arriving at the same door she had just exited, sometimes by 3 or 4 minutes. She noted the pattern without naming it. The second settlement was 2 hours north by carriage, a place called Outpost Zion, sitting in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines. It was smaller than Fenrir 20 buildings, a pack of 68. The sickness here was newer, caught earlier, which should have meant a better situation. It did not feel like a better situation. It felt like a settlement trying very hard to appear less frightened than it was. The elder here was a woman named Mabel Doolin, 70s, iron-backed, the kind of woman who had navigated enough hard seasons that she had stopped wasting energy pretending things were fine when they were not. Winnie liked her immediately. Mabel walked her through the sick room. 7 patients, all adults here. One of them, a young man named Emmett Voss, was in the worst shape, fever elevated, breathing shallow, not responding to the rudimentary treatment the local healer had tried. Winnie worked. She did not stop to register the sound of the door opening, but she registered what happened after. A small girl, 4, perhaps 5, appeared at the doorway, ignoring the adults who tried to redirect her, making a straight line for the pallet where Emmett Voss lay, his daughter. Winnie realized. She had that particular look of children who have decided something will not stop them. Karl was in the doorway. The child walked past 2 of his guards without slowing. She reached her father's pallet and sat down beside him on the floor with enormous dignity, cross-legged, and took his hand in both of hers. Winnie glanced at Karl. He was watching the child. His expression had done something she had not yet seen it do. The careful, controlled arrangement of his face had simply eased. Not into a smile. Into something older than a smile. Something that looked like recognition of a feeling he had not expected to encounter here. He stood very still in the doorway. He did not speak. Winnie returned to her work. 15 minutes later, when she straightened and turned, Karl was still there. He had not moved the girl. He had not asked anyone to remove her. He had simply allowed her to stay beside her father, holding his hand, because he seemed to understand that her being there was medicine of a kind that Winnie's herbs could not replicate. He crossed to the pallet, crouched, reached out with one hand, careful, measured, and adjusted the edge of the father's blanket where it had slipped. It was already adequate. The adjustment was unnecessary by any practical measure. He did it anyway. Then he stood and walked out. That evening, Karl's senior guard found Winnie in the outpost's supply room, cataloging what she needed for the next 3 stops on her circuit. He introduced himself as Alistair Draven, former military bearing, the kind that never fully leaves, but warmed by years of choosing to stay beside someone rather than simply serve them. He was perhaps 50, grey at the temples, a scar along his jaw that he wore without vanity or apology. He sat across from her at the supply table and said, "I want to tell you something about him, before you draw conclusions from what you are seeing." Winnie set down her ledger. "All right. The Alpha Bond covers every wolf pack in the Northern Reach. That is thousands of bonded lives. And what most people do not understand, what we do not advertise, because it would be used against him, is that for an Alpha with a territory this size, the bond does not just inform, it transmits." She waited. Pain, fear, grief, joy, when there is joy. Every significant feeling from every bonded wolf in this territory passes through the Alpha connection to him. Alistair's voice was flat, with the practiced calm of someone delivering information they have long accepted. For most Alphas, across a smaller number of bonds, this is bearable, manageable. For Karl, across this many lives, it is constant. There is no quiet, not during the day, not in the dark, not during sleep, when the Alpha bond is, if anything, louder than waking. Winnie was still. "He has not slept a full night in 4 years, Alistair said. "Not one full night. He does not share this information. He will not thank me for sharing it with you. But you are a healer, and you are clearly not without perception, and I would rather you understand what you are seeing than arrive at a colder interpretation. Why tell me?" Alistair was quiet for a moment. "Because he came back from the sick room at Fenrir this afternoon, and he sat at his desk for 3 hours without working. He just sat, and I have not seen him do that stop in longer than I can remember." He folded his hands on the table. "You are the first person in this territory who has spoken to him as though his title were beside the point." Winnie absorbed this information without letting it show on her face, which required more effort than she expected. "I have work to do," she said. "I know." Alistair stood. "So does he. I am only saying the legend and the man are not the same thing, and the man has been carrying something that nobody measured accurately for him." He left. The door closed. The supply room held very still. Winnie sat with the silence for a long moment. She thought about the lines at Karl's eyes, about the quality of his stillness that she had initially read as control, and was now rereading as something that looked more like endurance. She thought about 4 years. She thought about the child sitting on the floor beside her father, holding his hand. She pressed the ledger open again. She had supply orders to complete and 40 more minutes of light to work by. She told herself she was not thinking about Karl Haskins. She was absolutely thinking about Karl Haskins. The road between Outpost Fenrir and Outpost Zion's easternmost satellite, a cluster of 8 buildings called the Doolin Crossing, was 4 hours on a good day. This was not a good day. Snow had moved in from the upper ridges overnight, not heavy, but persistent. The road was ridged with frost. The carriage moved steadily, if not quickly, through a landscape gone gray and silver, the mountains visible only as suggestions through the falling white. Winnie had been awake for 37 hours. She was not proud of this. She was simply accurate about it. She had learned, over 3 years of circuit work in territories where the sick did not wait for her to be rested, that self-awareness about her limits was more useful than pride about pushing past them. The carriage held 2 passengers. Karl had offered her his guard's carriage, a separate vehicle, marginally larger. She had declined it on practical grounds. The road required both vehicles to travel with an armed escort, and there were not enough guards to split between 2 conveyances safely. She had made this calculation in approximately 4 seconds, and stated it plainly. He had accepted the logic without argument. What she had not factored into the calculation was what 4 hours in a small rattling box with Karl Haskins would feel like. She settled into the left side bench. He took the right. Between them, the lantern swayed with the movement of the carriage, throwing light and shadow in slow alternation across the space. She opened her notes. He looked out the window. The snow sifted down past the glass in fine, even curtains. For the first hour, she read, and he watched the landscape. The silence was not hostile. Neither was it easy. It was the silence of 2 people who were aware of each other in a way that had no clean category, not attraction, not wariness, not professional neutrality. Something with edges that none of those words covered. Then he said, "What brought you to healing?" The question landed in the quiet without announcement. She looked up. "I was good at it," she said, which was her usual answer. He waited, just waited, the particular patience of someone who had recognized a first answer that was not quite the real one. She looked at him for a moment. "It is one of the few things," she said, more carefully, "that makes the world feel like it is operating on logic I can follow. Illness follows rules. Bodies follow rules. If you understand the rules well enough and respond quickly enough, you can shift outcomes." She paused. "Not always, but often enough to be worth doing. And when the outcome does not shift, then I did what I could do. And I moved to the next place." He absorbed this. Outside, the snow continued its patient work on the road. "The bond," she said. She had not planned to say it. The word simply arrived, and she let it go rather than pull it back. "What does it feel like?" The connection to all of them, a long silence. "Like standing in a room," he said at last, his voice quieter than she had heard it, "where everyone is speaking at once. Not shouting, not even loudly, just continuously." He looked at the window. Every feeling, every shift. Fear, mostly. People in border territories carry a great deal of fear, grief, in cycles. Physical pain, when someone is injured. Joy occasionally, when something good happens somewhere and it moves through the connection before I know what caused it. He paused. "I have learned to identify which weight belongs to which pack by its quality. Each one feels distinct, but they never stop. Even when you sleep, especially." He said it without weight, without performance. Just as fact. Sleep removes the parts of the mind that are good at managing. Without those, what comes through is harder to organize. Winnie was quiet. She was doing arithmetic, the way she always did with information about the body, calculating what prolonged sleep deprivation did to the human system over 4 years. The cardiovascular effects, The cognitive effects. The deeper damage to things you could not see on the outside. That is why the lines, she said, without intending to say it aloud. I beg your pardon? The lines at your eyes. She felt heat in her face, which was unusual. I noticed them when I first arrived. I could not place the cause immediately. Now I can. Karl looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when she had done something he had not anticipated. Most people, he said, do not look at me long enough to notice details. Most people, she said, are looking at your title rather than your face. The carriage swayed. The lantern light moved between them in its slow rhythm. Somewhere in the second hour, Winnie's notes stopped making sense on the page. The letters blurred slightly, rearranged themselves in ways that meant she had passed the threshold where her eyes were reading without her mind following. She set the papers aside. She rested her head against the carriage wall. She closed her eyes for what she told herself would be 5 minutes. She was asleep in less than 2. She did not know, could not know, what happened in the carriage while she slept. Karl watched her for a moment. He noted, with the part of his mind that never fully stopped cataloguing, how different she looked when asleep. The professional alertness that characterized every waking expression she wore was simply absent, not replaced by vulnerability, exactly, but by rest. The kind of rest he had forgotten was possible. He turned back to the window. He watched the mountains move past in the dark. The bond pressed at him, as it always did. Somewhere far in the western reaches of his territory, someone was frightened. He felt it like a hand on his chest. To the north, in a settlement he had visited 3 years ago, something good was happening. He felt that too, a lighter pressure, almost warmth. He sorted through what he felt with the routine, exhausted precision of someone who had been doing this for so long, it no longer felt like a skill, only like an obligation that had been embedded directly into his chest. An hour passed. His eyes were heavy. They had been heavy for 4 years. He was accustomed to carrying the heaviness the way you carry a stone in your pocket. Always there, always pressing. The carriage swayed. The lantern light moved. His head tipped sideways. It did not tip far before it encountered something, a warmth, a steadiness, the slight resistance of a solid presence. He registered it only as comfort before sleep, which had been stalking him for years, finally closed the distance. He did not feel himself sleep. He simply was asleep. Winnie woke first, not suddenly, carefully, in the way she had trained herself to wake from the lightest edge of sleep inward, rather than from the jolt of alarm. She registered the carriage, the lantern, the snow outside the window. She registered the weight on her left shoulder, which was heavy and warm and entirely still. She looked left without moving her body. Karl Haskins was asleep on her shoulder. His breathing was the kind she only heard in her patients when they had finally broken through a fever deep, unguarded, with no management in it anywhere. His face, level with her collarbone, had released everything that was normally held in it. Not the careful stillness, not the controlled arrangement, just rest. Just a man who was not, in this moment, anything other than a person sleeping deeply for the first time in too long. She sat very still. She understood, with the clinical portion of her mind, what Alistair had told her. She understood what this meant. That her particular quality of stillness, the one she had cultivated through years of sitting beside frightened people without adding to their fear, had done something to the bond that Karl carried, had quieted it, perhaps, or given his system enough safety to stop managing long enough to rest. She did not try to explain it further than that. She looked at the window. The snow had eased. The mountains had emerged from the cloud, lit faintly by a quarter moon, enormous and silver, and entirely indifferent to the small carriage moving between them. She breathed. She counted, quietly, for something to do with her mind. She reached 47. She started again. She reached 83. She did not move. 3.5 hours after the carriage left Fenrir, it slowed for the Doolin crossing. The change in speed was slight, a gradual easing of pace as the road narrowed toward the outpost gate. Karl woke with a sharp inhale. Upright, alert. The way a person wakes who has learned to snap from sleep to awareness because there have been emergencies and sleep was never truly safe. He stared at the carriage wall for a half-second. Then he turned. Winnie was looking out the opposite window. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her notes were open on her knee. She had been in that position, to all appearances, for some time. "We are here," she said. Her voice was mild. Karl was very still. How long? The road was long. She picked up her satchel from the floor. And cold. And the carriage was not moving quickly. She reached for the door handle. "You needed the rest, Winnie." She stepped out into the cold before he finished the sentence. The air at Doolin Crossing was sharp enough to sting. She stood for a moment in it, pressing the cold against her face deliberately, and breathed. Inside her chest, something was happening that she did not have a policy about. She put her satchel over her shoulder and walked toward the settlement's main building, where the sick would be waiting and there was work to do. Behind her, she heard Karl exit the carriage. She heard him pause. She felt, in the particular way she felt things she could not explain, that he was looking at her back for a moment before he followed. She did not turn around. 1 week into her circuit through the northern reaches border settlements, Winnie found something that did not fit. She had visited 4 outposts. She had treated 31 patients. She had established treatment protocols, trained local healers in 2 settlements where the existing knowledge was insufficient, and sent supply requests through the proper channels. And she had noticed, in the way that careful people notice things that are not quite announced, that the sickness was not behaving the way a naturally spreading illness behaved. Natural spread was irregular. It moved in circles from a source, slowing at the edges, sometimes leaping when a traveler carried it far ahead of the main wave. It respected no pattern except proximity. This illness moved along lines. Specific lines. Lines that Winnie recognized once she laid 4 settlement maps beside each other on the floor of her room at night and traced what she was seeing as trade routes. The northern supply circuit. The routes that moved goods and people between settlements on a rotating 6-week schedule. Someone with specific knowledge of those routes could have predicted exactly which settlements would show symptoms and in what order. She sat with that information alone for 1 full night. She was not naive about what it might mean. She was not, however, ready to name what it might mean until she had enough certainty to be useful rather than alarmist. She spent 2 more days confirming, talking to elders, reconstructing timelines, cross-referencing records. Then she found the second piece. She found it, specifically, when she began comparing the reports that had been sent to Karl's council with the actual patient counts she had personally observed. The discrepancy was not enormous, it was careful. The kind of careful that someone calculated to stay within the range of plausible error. Deaths listed as 3 when they were 4. Spread described as contained when it was active. Numbers adjusted just enough to suggest that the situation was difficult but manageable. The situation was not manageable, not on the trajectory she was observing, and Karl had been making decisions about resources, about deployment, about where to send guards and supplies based on numbers that had been adjusted specifically to prevent his alarm. Winnie sat in the small room they had given her at Outpost Zion's main building, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time rising in her chest. It was anger. Not the hot, immediate kind, the slow kind, the kind that builds from the bottom up when you understand clearly what has been done and who it was done to. She thought about a man who had not slept in 4 years, who carried thousands of lives inside his chest every moment, who had been, by every account and by her own observation, trying genuinely and at enormous personal cost to do right by every pack in his territory. And someone, in the councils that surrounded him, had decided that managing his perception was more important than managing the truth. She made her decision before dawn. Karl was in the settlement's council room with 3 advisors when she walked in. She knocked once. She opened the door. She walked in. Edmund Riker, head of the inner council, a composed man of perhaps 55, whose composure had the particular quality of something that had been carefully constructed rather than naturally grown, began to rise. There was a standard sentence that began in his expression, something diplomatic and dismissive simultaneously. She did not acknowledge him. She crossed directly to Karl and placed her 4 settlement maps on the table in front of him, each one marked with the patient counts she had personally observed and the timeline she had reconstructed. "I need 10 minutes, she said. "Please." Karl looked at her. He looked at the maps. He said, "To the room in general." "Give us the room." Edmund Riker did not move immediately. "Your Majesty, perhaps." "The room," Karl said. "The same volume. A completely different register." The advisors filed out. Riker last, and his exit had a quality to it controlled, deliberate, that Winnie filed away for later. When the door closed, she spoke. She did not embellish. She did not perform. She laid out what she had found. The pattern in the illness, the evidence of its movement along the trade routes, and then, carefully, plainly, the discrepancy between the figures in the official reports and the numbers she had personally documented in the field. Karl listened with the complete, focused attention she had come to associate specifically with him. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "Show me the specific figures," he said. She did. Column by column, settlement by settlement. He was silent for a long time, long enough that she began to count, quietly, in the back of her mind. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough to be certain I was not misreading the data, not so long that I delayed past usefulness." "Why tell me? You are not bonded to this territory. You have no stake in what happens here after your circuit is complete." Winnie met his eyes. "Because you have been carrying a weight that was never accurately measured for you. Someone has been managing what you know, which means you have been making decisions in incomplete light. That is not what someone who is trying to do right by their people deserves." The silence stretched. "You are not afraid of what I will do with this information," Karl said. It was the first time she had heard uncertainty in his voice, not about the information, but about her, about why she was doing this. "I am a little afraid," she said honestly, "but not in any way that would have stopped me from telling you." He stood. He moved to the window. He stood there for a long moment with his back to her, which she allowed because it was clearly necessary. When he turned back, his expression was not what she expected. She had anticipated cold authority, executive decision, the face of a man who had immediately processed and categorized and moved to action. What she saw instead was something raw, something closer to a person who had just understood a sentence they had misread for months. "Valerie Axel," he said. "Do you know the name? Your court liaison. I have met her briefly. She has been trying to tell me something was wrong with the reports for 3 months. I trusted the process. I trusted the council to manage their portfolios with integrity." He looked at his hands on the table. "I was in error. You were deceived. Those are different things." He looked at her. "You are being generous. I am being accurate." She gathered her maps. "What you do with what I have told you is yours to decide. I have more settlements to visit. I will send full reports through Valerie Axel going forward, with your permission. Nothing filtered." "Yes," he said. She moved toward the door. "Winnie." She stopped. "Thank you." He said it the way he said things when they cost him something. Carefully. Precisely. For not softening it. "I would not know how," she said. "That has always been my professional limitation." She could hear, as she left the room, something behind her that might, if the listener were generous and the room were otherwise silent, have qualified as a brief exhale of amusement from a man who had not found much to be amused by in a very long time. That evening, Edmund Riker was removed from his position at the head of the Inner Council. Winnie heard about it from Alistair, who appeared at her door with a look of satisfied grimness. "Valerie Axel has his desk," Alistair said. "The reports going forward will be accurate." "Good," Winnie said. "Karl asked me to tell you he will be reviewing every report from the last 3 years. That will take time. He is aware." Alistair paused. "He also asked me to tell you, and I am quoting directly, that he is not as good at saying things as he is at doing them. So consider this his way of saying something he is not quite ready to say directly." Winnie held very still. "And what is that?" Alistair looked at her with the quiet patience of a man who has waited out many storms. "I think he would prefer to tell you himself, when he works out the phrasing." He left. Winnie closed the door. She stood in the center of her small room and pressed her hand flat against her chest, above the place where something warm had taken up residence, without her explicit permission. She breathed. She told herself it was nothing. She was not particularly convincing. The sickness at Outpost Zion peaked on a Tuesday. Winnie knew it was the peak because she had been tracking the progression curve in her notes every 6 hours, and the numbers at midday Tuesday were the worst they had been since she arrived. 2 children critical simultaneously. The young father, Emmett Voss, in regression after 3 days of apparent improvement. She worked through Tuesday without stopping. Karl was there throughout. She had stopped finding this remarkable Karl. He simply appeared where the work was happening, which she had come to understand was not surveillance. It was the behavior of a man who had spent his life avoiding inactivity, who could not simply wait in a comfortable room while his people were in difficulty. He did not interfere with her medicine. He did not give instructions that contradicted hers. He anticipated with that precise, particular competence she had noticed in his council room what was needed before she asked. Supplies that would have taken 3 hours to arrive took 40 minutes. A healer from a neighboring settlement, whose specific expertise Winnie had mentioned in passing the previous day, appeared by noon. She did not say thank you because she was working. She looked up and met his eyes for 1 second, and he nodded, and went back to whatever he was coordinating on his end. By morning Wednesday, all 3 critical patients were stable. Emmett Voss was awake. His daughter Winnie had learned her name was Pearl, which suited her enormously, was asleep in a chair beside his bed, still holding his hand, her small face finally relaxed. Winnie walked outside. The morning was the color of pewter. The air was sharp and clean and cold enough to be felt all the way down. She sat down on the ground outside the sickroom door, her back against the rough stone wall, knees pulled toward her chest. She was not sleeping. She was simply being still, which was different. She heard footsteps. Karl sat down beside her. Not across, not at a professional distance. Beside her, on the ground, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold morning air. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the mountains. "You do not have to carry all of it," he said, quietly. She blinked. "Neither do you," she said. The silence between them was different from every silence they had shared before. Not tense, not negotiated, just 2 people who were tired in the same direction, sitting with that truth. They talked slowly, without planning it. Karl told her about the bond in more detail than he had in the carriage, not the diplomatic summary, but the actual texture of it, how each pack's signal felt different, how the Western packs carried a particular quality of worry that came from the border disputes, low-level and chronic, how the settlements in the high passes carried something quieter and more self-sufficient, how children's feelings came through the bond more vividly than adults, cleaner somehow, less filtered, which meant a child in distress at the far edge of the territory could be felt with startling immediacy. "That is why Emmett's daughter," Winnie said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew she was frightened before I walked into that room. I felt it the way you feel, a sound that cuts through ambient noise, sharper, more defined. When I saw her, I already knew her, in some basic way, before I knew anything about her. Winnie thought about what it meant to feel a small child's fear from across a territory, to know it, to carry it, along with thousands of others, at all hours. I do not know how you have managed this alone for 4 years, she said. Not a compliment, an honest assessment. I have not managed it, Karl said. I have endured it. Those are not the same. The distinction hit her somewhere quiet and precise, she told him. Then not everything, but the edge of the truth she had kept behind her professional manner since arriving. She told him about the pack. 3 years ago. A sickness not entirely unlike the one she was fighting now, in a territory that did not have what the Northern Reach had, the resources, the organization, the infrastructure to respond quickly enough. She had been on a circuit when it happened. She returned to a settlement that was already grieving. Most of them recovered, she said. Her voice was steady because she had practiced making it steady. Not all of them. Who did you lose? A name she had not said aloud in 11 months rose in her throat. Her name was Lorena Cross, Winnie said. She was the pack healer before me. She taught me everything I know about reading early symptoms. She was 73 years old and sharp as winter, and she used to tell me I had good hands for the work. She stopped. She was the last person who felt like home. Karl was quiet. Is that why you travel? He asked, and his voice was as careful with the question as she had been with the answer. I stay until the work is done, she said, and then I leave before I have time to think about why staying would be better. That is a very lonely way to live. She looked at him. You are calling me lonely. He looked back. Something in his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, not because he had chosen to open it, but because the early morning and the cold ground and the exhaustion had simply removed the mechanism for keeping it closed. Yes, he said. I am aware of the irony. She felt the laugh come before she could decide whether to allow it a real one, soft and genuine, startled out of her by the particular dry accuracy of the observation. Karl's expression shifted. Marginally, the faintest suggestion of something that was almost a smile, and she saw for the first time what his face might look like if he let himself be something other than a king. It was significant. She filed it away under things that are becoming more difficult to set aside. We should go in, she said. Pearl will wake up and want breakfast. She will want her father to see her eat breakfast, Karl said. There is a distinction. Winnie looked at him, surprised. He stood. He held out his hand to help her up, a simple, automatic gesture, nothing elaborate about it, and she took it, and he drew her to her feet with easy care. He released her hand after a second. She was aware of the releasing for longer than was professionally warranted. They walked back into the settlement side by side, in the thin gray light, and neither of them named anything that the morning had just done to the space between them. 3 days later, the sickness in the Northern Reach began to retreat. Not dramatically, illness never retreated dramatically. It released its grip slowly, patient in withdrawal as it had been in advance. The numbers in Winnie's daily reports moved in the right direction, then stayed moving in the right direction, then did so consistently enough that she could begin to plan for departure. She had not let herself think about departure until now. She thought about it sitting in the outpost library, a warm room lined with ledgers and old record books, and very little of what she would call literature, going through her final settlement reports with a precision she was applying more heavily than strictly necessary. Valerie Axel found her there. Valerie was 42, dark-eyed, and possessed of the particular intelligence that comes not from education alone, but from years of paying close attention and choosing, carefully, when to use what she had learned. She carried 2 cups of warm tea. She sat across from Winnie without being invited, which Winnie respected. He asked about you, Valerie said. Not as an introduction, just as a fact, delivered without ceremony. Winnie looked up. About the reports? About whether you were eating properly. Valerie set one cup in front of Winnie, which is not a question he has asked about anyone in this territory in my 6 years of service to him. Winnie wrapped her hands around the cup. It was a useful thing to do with her hands. He also, Valerie continued, spent 40 minutes yesterday afternoon sitting in the corridor outside the room where you were working. He did not go in. He did not send a message. He just sat. Alistair told me. He looked, according to Alistair, like a man who had discovered that a place felt different than it used to and was uncertain what to do with that information. Valerie, I am simply reporting. You are editorially reporting. I am reporting with context. Valerie sipped her tea. I have known Karl Haskins through 3 crises, 2 failed alliances, and 1 particularly miserable winter in which the western passes were closed for 6 weeks and everyone ran out of what they needed. I have never once, not once, seen him sit still without purpose. He does not do that. Stillness, for its own sake, is not in his vocabulary. Winnie looked at her cup. I am leaving when the work is done, she said. That has always been the plan. I know that is what you have told yourself, Valerie said. It is not just what I have told myself. It is what I do. Yes. Valerie was gentle about it. And I am sitting here across from you at... She glanced at the window past 9 in the evening, when you have no medical reason to still be working, asking myself whether you are the kind of person who does things because they are what you do, or the kind of person who does things because they want to. A long quiet. I lost someone, Winnie said. She had not planned to say it. The words simply arrived with a kind of readiness, as though they had been waiting for a room that felt safe enough. 3 years ago, someone who was everything that staying meant. And when she was gone, I decided that moving was safer than staying, and I have been moving since. Valerie set down her cup. I am sorry. I am not looking for sympathy. Winnie was not unkind about it, just clear. I am explaining the logic. Staying means caring. Caring means potential for loss. Loss means... She stopped. Loss means the thing you are still carrying, Valerie said quietly. Winnie did not answer. He is carrying something like that too, Valerie said. He is just carrying it in the opposite direction. He stopped letting people in because loss at the scale he operates frightened him. You stopped staying because it frightened you, both of you. She paused. It is quite something to watch 2 people with the exact same fear choosing the exact opposite expression of it. Winnie stood, which was not an exit, but which gave her space to breathe without an audience watching her. Valerie stood too. She picked up her cup. I am not asking you to do anything. I am only asking you to notice what you already know. She left Winnie alone in the library, with cooling tea and a very honest piece of information she was not ready to categorize. 2 evenings later, Winnie was in the outpost courtyard when it began to snow. Not the heavy, purposeful snow of a real storm, the soft, unhurried kind, small flakes drifting down from a white sky as though they had nowhere particular to be. She had come outside to think, which was a thing she did when the thinking required more space than a room provided. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, the shift in the air that she had come to associate specifically with Karl, which she had stopped trying to explain and simply accepted as data. He came to stand beside her, not across from her, not at the comfortable professional distance they had maintained in most of their conversations. Beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, both of them looking at the falling snow. She waited. Winnie, he said. His voice was different when he said her name now. She had noticed this and not commented on it. Yes, when the work here is done. He stopped. She recognized the beginning of what he was about to say, the way you recognize the opening of a sentence you have been dreading in the most complicated possible way. Do not, she said softly. I have not finished. You were going to ask me to stay. I was. She pressed her hands together. The snow fell between them, indifferent and lovely. I am not someone who stays, she said. I told you that, on the ground outside the sick room. That was the truth. I know it was the truth. He was quiet for a moment. I am not asking you to be someone you are not. I am asking you to consider whether who you are is the same as who you have become since Lorena Cross died. The name from his mouth startled her into stillness. Alistair told me, he said. He tells me things he thinks I need to know. I am rarely grateful for it. This time I was. He turned to look at her, and the snow was falling between them in the soft dark. I am not asking you to pretend the grief is gone. I am not asking you to promise anything about forever. I am only asking. He stopped, searched, started again. I am only asking whether the reason you leave is because you genuinely need to, or because you have practiced leaving for so long that it has become the reflex. Winnie's breath was visible in the cold air. She watched it for a moment. That is not a fair question, she said. No, he agreed. It is not. He turned back to face the snow. She felt him there, the warmth of him, close and steady. The same quality she had felt on that carriage floor, the quality her body had filed under safe before her mind had voted on it. I have been alone in this for a long time, he said. Not a bid for sympathy, just a factual offering, placed between them for her to do with as she chose. I am not good at needing. I did not think I was allowed to be. And then you walked into that sick room and told me to step out of your light. And something, he paused. Something in here. He touched his chest. Briefly, became slightly less loud. She looked at him. You have been sleeping, she said. It was not a question. She had noticed it in his face over the last 4 days, the gradual easing of those lines. The way the quality of his stillness had changed from endurance to something closer to actual rest. Since the carriage, he said. Since that night. I do not understand it clinically. I only know that it started then. It is the bond, she said. My particular, Lorena called it a quality of stillness. She said some healers have it. The instinctive part of a wolf recognizes it as safety and stops sending distress signals upward through the connection. You stop managing the noise because near someone like me, the noise itself reduces. He looked at her. You knew this. I suspected it. And you did not move in the carriage because you were sleeping, she said simply. And you needed to. The snow fell between them. Karl turned toward her fully, which required her to turn toward him. The space between them was smaller than she had let it be in any of their previous conversations. I am not good at asking for things, he said. I have spent years making sure I never had to, but I want. He exhaled. I want to learn how. I want to be. He was quiet for a long moment, searching for the honest version, less alone. I want to know what that is actually like, not as a diplomatic arrangement, not as a political solution. He held her gaze. Just with you. However that is possible. Winnie looked at him in the falling snow and felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully not naming do something specific and undeniable. I am afraid, she said quietly. I am aware. I am afraid of staying. She pressed her thumbnail against her palm, an old habit, of caring about somewhere again and losing it. I'm afraid, he said, of exactly the same thing. From the other direction, she looked at him. If I let you in, he said, and you leave, that is significantly worse than never having had this. He said it with the raw simplicity of someone who had stopped performing a very long time ago. At least for tonight, at least with her. I recognize that is the same fear you are carrying. I just needed you to know it goes in more than one direction. The snow continued to fall. Winnie's hands were folded at her sides. She was very still. I am not ready to answer you tonight, she said. I know, he said, but I heard what you said. I know that too. They stood together in the snow for another few minutes, not touching, not resolving anything, just present in the same space with the honest things between them, and neither of them running from it. Then Winnie said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and she went inside. She did not sleep for 2 hours. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence, the real silence, the kind that existed here in the northern reach in a way it did not in warmer places, a silence with weight and presence, and she let herself think about what it would mean to stay. Not the practical meaning, the real meaning, what it would mean to belong somewhere again, what it would mean to care about someone specific, with their specific face and their specific exhaustion and the precise way they had adjusted an already adequate blanket because there was a child nearby, and they did not know what to do with the feeling of that. She pressed her hand over her chest. She counted slowly to 12. She slept. The morning of her departure arrived the way mornings arrived in the northern reach, without announcement, without ceremony, in the grey half-light before the sun cleared the eastern ridgelines. Winnie was in the courtyard at first dawn. Her satchel was over her shoulder. Her carriage was ready. The driver, a quiet man named Rufus Finch, who had been her driver across 4 outposts and who had, at some point in the 3rd week, begun leaving small cups of tea outside her door at 6 in the morning without being asked, was seeing to the horses with the purposeful care of someone giving the principals time to manage something that was not his business to witness. She stood in the courtyard. The mountains were copper and pewter in the early light, the snow on their highest reaches just beginning to catch the first thin gold at the very peaks. Below her, the settlement was quiet. Not the fearful quiet of the sick-room days, the natural quiet of early morning, of people still sleeping, of a place resting before it began again. She had fixed what she came to fix. The illness was retreating cleanly. The treatment protocols were documented and in capable hands. The reports were, going forward, accurate and unfiltered, which was as close to a structural repair as she knew how to make. She had done her work. She told herself she was ready to go. She heard him behind her. Not footsteps, just the quality of the air. She had learned his particular gravity over 4 weeks, the way a space oriented itself slightly when he was in it, not through anything performed, just through the accumulated weight of who he was. She turned before he spoke. Karl crossed the courtyard without hurrying. He was dressed practically, as he always was, the dark coat, nothing elaborate. He had not slept in a way that showed at a distance, which was the first evidence she registered. He stopped in front of her. She waited. He said, "I slept last night." She was still. "The whole night," he said. "From full dark to dawn. I did not wake once." He held her gaze steadily. "This is the 2nd time in 4 years I have done that. The first time was in the carriage." She thought about the carriage, the lantern light, the snow. "There is something I want to tell you," he said. "And I want to tell it to you before you leave, because I would rather say it directly than wonder for the rest of my life whether I should have." She waited. "I am not going to tell you that you must stay." His voice was even, unhurried. "I am not going to argue with the logic you have built for yourself. I know why you move. I know what it costs you to stop. I am not asking you to pretend that cost is not real." She nodded. "But I want to tell you what has happened in this territory in the 4 weeks you have been here." He did not look at his hands. He looked at her. "The sickness is retreating. My counsel is honest. My reports are accurate. Valerie Axel has rebuilt 3 months of faulty information into something I can actually use." He paused. Pearl Voss stopped being frightened. "Emmett Voss is going to recover fully." Clara McGraw asked her mother for soup. Winnie's throat moved. "None of that is because of me," Karl said. "All of that is because of you, because you came here without any obligation to care, and you cared anyway, completely. For every person in every outpost, from Harlan Bonner's settlement right through to Mabel Doolin's, you cared the way people care when they cannot help themselves, when caring is simply what they do. He paused. I have watched you for 4 weeks, and I want you to know I have never in my life envied anyone. I built this territory on refusing to want anything I could not create through my own effort. He was quiet for a moment. I envy every person in those settlements who has had the ordinary experience of simply being in your orbit, who has been looked after by you, who woke up from fever and found you there. Winnie looked at him and felt something in her chest that did not have a clean name. Grief and tenderness and longing all pressed together into one sensation that was almost indistinguishable from fear, except that it was not fear at all. Karl, she said. I slept because of you, he said. The bond quieted because of you. Alistair told me what that means, the healer's stillness, the way it works through the connection. I understand the clinical explanation. He paused. But I also know that I have not wanted to be in a room as much as I have wanted to be in whatever room you were in for the entirety of the last 4 weeks. She pressed her hand against her satchel strap. I am still afraid, she said, of staying, she stopped, of losing something again. I know, he said. I am afraid of the same thing. He did not move toward her. He was giving her the full distance of the choice. I told you in the snow that having you and losing you would be worse than never having had this. That is still true. I am not asking you to protect me from that possibility. I am asking you to make the choice freely, not from the fear of losing, not from the habit of leaving, from what you actually want. She stood very still in the early morning light. Rufus Finch was being very thorough about those horses. She thought about Lorena Cross, who had looked at her across a patient's bedside 20 years ago and said, "You have good hands for this work, child," who had taught her every important thing she knew, who had been, for a long time, the answer to the question of where home was. She thought about what it had felt like to come back and find that answer gone. She thought about 3 years of moving, of arriving and staying until the work was done and leaving before belonging could take root, of being useful and warm and professionally present and never, not once, letting herself be somewhere deeply enough to risk that kind of loss again. She thought about a cold carriage and a man who had not slept in 4 years, sleeping on her shoulder for 3.5 hours. She thought about adjusting a blanket that did not need adjusting because there was a child nearby, and he did not know what to do with the feeling of caring about something small. She thought about cold ground and copper mountains, and a thin morning where 2 exhausted people had been honest with each other in a way that left marks. She put down her satchel. The sound it made on the courtyard stones was small and specific and completely clear. They both looked at it. Then she looked at him. I have been very afraid, she said, for 3 years, and I have been very useful. She took a breath. And I am so tired of mistaking useful for happy. Karl's expression moved in a way she had not seen it move before, not the careful management, not the controlled arrangement, not even the rare, almost smiles she had catalogued over 4 weeks. Something beneath all of those, something that had been waiting behind every one of those expressions since the morning in the sick room when she told him to step out of her light. He crossed to her. He moved the way he did everything deliberately, giving her time. He raised his hands to her face, large, careful hands, the hands of someone who had spent a long time understanding that strength and gentleness were not opposites, only different applications of the same attention, and he held her face the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping. He pressed his forehead to hers. She felt his breath in the cold air, mixing with hers. She felt the bond, not directly, not in the way he felt it, but in some translated form, the way you feel someone else's weight when they lean against you. Thousands of lives, pressing gently through the connection, all of them slightly warmer than they had been 4 weeks ago. She did not know if that was real or imagined. Stay, he said, quietly, without performance or demand. She closed her eyes. Yes, she said. The word did not resolve everything. She would not romanticize it into that. She knew, with the clear-eyed practicality she had spent 3 years honing, that yes was a beginning, not an ending. That there were things to learn still, about each other, and about the specific shape of a life shared between two people who had both, in their respective ways, forgotten what sharing looked like. She knew that grief did not retire on demand, that Lorena Cross would still arrive in her memory at unexpected angles, that belonging again would require her to rebuild tolerance for a vulnerability she had spent years deliberately atrophying. She knew that Karl, for his part, had years of isolation to slowly unknit, that there would be evenings when the bond pressed too hard and he would go quiet and cold, and she would need to simply sit beside him and not take it as rejection. That he would need to relearn, in small increments, that needing something did not automatically mean losing it. She knew all of that. She still said yes. 2 months later, on an ordinary evening in the settlement's main building, Winnie was asleep in the chair she had begun to think of as hers. Karl was at the desk across the room, working through supply reports. They were accurate, every one of them. Valerie Axel's name was in the header of each. The fire was low, but sufficient. Outside, the northern reach held the particular winter silence that she had come to love, deep, with presence, a silence you could lean against. Karl set down his pen. He looked across the room at her. Her book was open on her lap, spine up where she had let it fall when she drifted off. Her head tipped slightly against the chair's back. The firelight moved across her face in its slow rhythm. He stood. He crossed the room quietly. He took the book from her lap and closed it around his thumb as a marker, set it on the table beside her. He picked up his coat from the back of his own chair. He laid it over her, the way you cover someone sleeping with attention, as though the gesture itself mattered, as though the quality of care in the placing of a coat over a sleeping person was not a small thing, but a specific thing, a chosen thing. He straightened, stood for a moment, looking at her. He went back to his desk. He picked up his pen. He opened the next report. The bond in his chest was not silent. It was never silent, but it was lower than it had been in 4 years. The constant pressure of thousands of lives, still present, still real, but no longer the only thing in the room. She was in the room. That, it turned out, made an extraordinary difference. The most dangerous alpha in existence sat at his desk in the firelight and worked through his reports and breathed. And for the first time in a very long time, the breathing was not an act of endurance. It was simply breathing. Outside, the northern reach stretched in all directions under a winter sky full of stars so cold and clear they looked like something from before history. The settlements were quiet. In outpost Fenrir, Clara McGraw was sleeping peacefully with her mother's hand at her back. At Doolin Crossing, Pearl Voss had developed a habit of leaving small gifts outside the door of the healer's room, a smooth stone, a dried flower for the woman who had stayed beside her father all those nights, though the woman was no longer there to receive them. Mabel Doolin was awake at her kitchen table, reviewing the new treatment protocols, making notes in her practical and unhurried hand. All of it moved through the bond. All of it reached Karl, as it always did, as it always would. But alongside it, quieter, warmer, more fundamental than any of it was the particular signal that moved through the connection from the room across the desk. The signal that his instincts, before his mind had voted, had already categorized in their own basic language. Safe, home, still here. He did not need to look up to know she was sleeping peacefully. He felt it. He kept working. Here is what was true. Winnie Valor had moved for 3 years because she was afraid of belonging somewhere and losing it. Karl Haskins had held everyone at a distance for 4 years because he was afraid of the same thing from the opposite angle. Both of them had built elaborate systems around their particular flavors of fear, and both systems had worked exactly as well as systems built from fear ever work, which is to say, they had kept the unbearable thing away. And they had also, in keeping the unbearable thing away, kept every good thing away with it, until a cold morning and a sick child and a woman who told a king to step out of her light, until a carriage and a lantern and 4 hours of ordinary exhaustion that cracked the simplest possible opening, until cold ground and honest words and a snowfall that did not care about the significance of what was happening beneath it, until a morning when she put her satchel down and he pressed his forehead to hers and the word yes fell between them like the first warm thing either of them had felt in a very long time. Some stories announced themselves. This one arrived quietly, the way real things tend to arrive, and it stayed. The most dangerous alpha in existence fell asleep on her shoulder. She did not move, and everything, slowly, began. This was the story of two people who forgot that strength and need are not opposites, who forgot that being seen is not the same as being destroyed, who forgot or maybe never knew that love does not always walk through the front door with a declaration. Sometimes it falls asleep beside you, and the bravest thing you ever do is simply stay still and let it rest. If this story stayed with you, if Karl and Winnie's quiet, careful, earned love is the kind that resonates in a place you were not expecting, please leave a comment below. Tell me which moment caught you. Tell me where you were watching from. Tell me if you have ever been the person who moved to avoid the risk of staying, or the person who kept everyone at a distance to avoid the risk of losing, because this story is for both of you. Subscribe if you would like more stories like this one. Stories about people who are not quite who the world says they are, finding each other in the spaces between what they were supposed to be. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded. You are allowed to put the satchel down. You are allowed to stay.